They told you Iran was finished. The sanctions were supposed to collapse the economy. The pressure campaign was supposed to fracture the government. The people were supposed to rise up, tear down the Islamic Republic, and hand Washington a bloodless victory. That was the plan. That was the narrative fed to you through every major outlet, every think tank briefing, every carefully worded State Department press conference for the past 4 decades. And yet, Iran is still standing. Not just surviving, functioning, trading, expanding its regional influence, signing energy deals with China, deepening ties with Russia, plugging into the emerging multipolar economic architecture that Washington spent trillions trying to prevent. The country that was supposed to implode under maximum pressure has instead become a case study in geopolitical resilience. And that fact alone should make every serious American stop and ask the uncomfortable question: what do we actually know about how power really works in this world? Because what's happening with Iran right now isn't just about Iran. It's about the entire Western strategic playbook and whether it's falling apart in real time. Let's start with the basics, because I think most Americans have been given a fundamentally distorted picture of what Iran actually is. When you turn on cable news, you see one of two things. Either Iran is a rogue regime on the verge of building a nuclear weapon that threatens all of civilization, or it's a broken, desperate country whose population is seconds away from overthrowing its own government. Both of those images serve a purpose. Both of them are carefully constructed, and neither of them is accurate. The reality of Iran is far more complex, far more interesting, and frankly far more instructive about how the modern world actually operates than anything you're going to hear from a pundit on a primetime panel show. Iran is a country of nearly 90 million people. It sits on some of the largest proven oil and natural gas reserves on the planet. It has a young, educated population, a literacy rate above 85%, one of the highest rates of university enrollment in the entire Middle East, and a scientific and engineering community that has managed, under crushing sanctions, to develop ballistic missile technology, drone manufacturing capability, and yes, a nuclear enrichment program that has survived decades of sabotage, assassination, and economic warfare. Now, you can have any opinion you want about the Iranian government, but if you look at those facts honestly, what you're describing is not a failed state. What you're describing is a resilient, functional civilization that has been under siege and has refused to break. And that refusal, or that stubborn, defiant resilience, is exactly what has upended the calculations of every Western strategist who thought they had the playbook figured out. Because the playbook was straightforward. You apply sanctions, you strangle the economy, the currency collapses, inflation runs wild, unemployment spikes, and eventually the population turns on its own government. It worked in other places, or at least it appeared to work. So why hasn't it worked in Iran? That's the question nobody in Washington wants to answer honestly, because the honest answer is deeply uncomfortable. The honest answer is that sanctions as a geopolitical weapon have a shelf life. They work best when they're sudden, when they're comprehensive, and when the targeted country has no alternative economic architecture to plug into. Iran has been under American sanctions in one form or another since 1979. That's nearly half a century. What that long timeline has actually done is force Iran to build workarounds, to develop domestic industries, to build alternative trading networks, to get very good at operating in the gray zones of international finance. The Iranians didn't sit around waiting for relief. They adapted, and the world they adapted into now looks very different from the world of 1979 or even the world of 2015 when the nuclear deal was signed. Because here's what changed. China happened. The Belt and Road Initiative happened. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization expanded. The BRICS grouping went from being an acronym on an economics paper to being a serious geopolitical bloc with a combined GDP that rivals the Western world. Russia, after 2022, stopped pretending it was going to integrate into the Western-led order and began actively building an alternative. And Iran, which had been sitting on the outside of the global financial system for decades, suddenly found itself in the middle of a new architecture that was being built precisely to route around the dollar, route around SWIFT, and route around American leverage. Iran didn't just benefit from this shift. In many ways, Iran was the prototype for it. Every country that got sanctioned by Washington watched how Iran survived and took notes. Now let's talk about the economics more specifically, because I know some of you are thinking, but the Iranian rial collapsed, inflation is brutal, ordinary Iranians are suffering. And that's true. I'm not going to sit here and tell you everything is fine for the average Iranian family. It isn't. The sanctions have caused real pain. But here's the distinction that almost nobody in Western media bothers to make. Economic pain and political collapse are not the same thing. They are not automatically connected. The assumption that if you make people's lives hard enough, they will overthrow their government is a very Western, very liberal, very particular theory of political behavior. And it turns out that theory doesn't hold universally, especially when the people being squeezed can see clearly and plainly that their suffering is being deliberately engineered from outside their country. That changes the psychology entirely. What was supposed to produce rage against the government instead produced, in many Iranians, a kind of nationalist defiance. Not loyalty to every policy the government makes, but a refusal to be the instrument of a foreign power's agenda. You saw this dynamic play out during the protests of 2022 and 2023. The Western media was electric with excitement. This was it, they said. This was the moment. The women, life, freedom movement was real. The grievances were real. The anger was real. And I want to be very clear. The frustrations of Iranian women and young Iranians about social restrictions are legitimate and serious. I'm not dismissing that. But what the Western narrative machine did was immediately frame those protests as a revolutionary moment that was about to topple the Islamic Republic. Cable news ran countdown clocks. Analysts talked about regime change like it was already scheduled. And then it didn't happen. The government weathered it. And that created this strange cognitive dissonance in Western capitals, where the question became not did we misread the situation, but rather how did the regime survive? As if survival was the anomaly that needed explaining rather than the original prediction being wrong. The prediction was wrong because it was built on a false model of how political power actually works in Iran. The Islamic Republic is not a monolith, and it's not simply a dictatorship holding down a uniformly oppressed population. It is a complex, layered political system with genuine internal factions, real political competition, economic interests tied to its survival, and, critically, a revolutionary guard structure that is deeply embedded in the economy, in the military, and in the social fabric, in ways that don't dissolve just because there are protests in Tehran. You may not like that system. Many Iranians don't like many aspects of that system, but liking it and understanding it are two different things. Western policy has consistently failed Iran because it has chosen preference over understanding. And now we get to what happens next, which is really the most important part of this conversation. Because Iran's stability, relative, imperfect, contested stability, but stability nonetheless, has enormous implications for where the Middle East goes from here and for where American influence in that region goes from here. Let's walk through what's actually on the table. First, you have the nuclear question. Iran's enrichment program has continued to advance during every period of failed diplomacy. The country is now enriching uranium to levels that put it closer to weapons grade than at any point in its history. The International Atomic Energy Agency has reported reduced cooperation. The JCPOA is effectively dead, not just on life support, actually dead, and there is no serious diplomatic replacement in sight. So you have a situation where the technical capability is advancing, the diplomatic channel is closed, and the military option, which American and Israeli planners keep putting back on the table, carries consequences so severe that even the most hawkish analysts struggle to fully game it out. A military strike on Iranian nuclear facilities would not end the program. Every serious assessment says it would set it back by a few years at most. What it would do is remove whatever remaining Iranian motivation exists to not build a bomb, and it would ignite a regional conflict that nobody has a clean exit strategy for. Second, you have Iran's expanding role in the regional power architecture. The Abraham Accords were sold to the American public as a transformative realignment of the Middle East, and they were significant. But what's happened since then has been equally significant in the opposite direction. The Saudi-Iran normalization deal brokered by China in 2023 was a genuine earthquake, not because it resolved every tension between Riyadh and Tehran, but because it demonstrated that China could broker a deal between two bitter regional rivals while the United States was not in the room. That is a statement about influence. That is a statement about who the key players in the region are now trusting to mediate their interests. The fact that it was China sitting at that table and not Washington tells you something profound about how the geopolitical landscape has shifted. And Iran has used that normalization space. Hezbollah remains the most powerful non-state military force in the region. The Houthis in Yemen demonstrated during the Gaza conflict that they could effectively threaten commercial shipping in the Red Sea, one of the world's most critical trade choke points, and absorb American and British airstrikes without backing down. The Iraqi militias aligned with Tehran have consolidated their position. The web of influence that Iran has spent decades building, now what they call the axis of resistance, has proven more durable than Western analysts consistently predicted. Again, this is not an endorsement of any of these groups or their methods. It's an observation about reality. And reality has to be the starting point for serious analysis. Third, and I think most underappreciated by the American public, is Iran's integration into the emerging multipolar economic order. Iran became a full member of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization in 2023. It joined the BRICS grouping in 2024. It has signed a 25-year comprehensive cooperation agreement with China worth hundreds of billions of dollars. Oil for investment, essentially, but at a scale and with a strategic depth that represents a fundamental reorientation of Iran's economic future away from Western integration. The pipelines are being planned, the rail connections are being mapped, the financial mechanisms to trade outside the dollar system are being constructed. This is not a temporary workaround. This is a new economic reality that is being cemented year by year, and the longer American sanctions remain in place, the more permanent and deep these alternative connections become. Here is what I want Americans to really sit with for a moment. The sanctions policy, the maximum pressure approach, was designed to coerce Iran back to the negotiating table on terms favorable to Washington. That was the stated goal. Instead, what it has actually achieved is pushing Iran deeper into the arms of America's two principal strategic competitors, China and Russia. It has given Tehran every incentive to help develop alternative financial systems that undermine dollar dominance. It has provided a real-world laboratory for other countries, Venezuela, North Korea, Russia, and eventually perhaps others, to study how to survive and operate outside the Western-led system. The policy designed to weaken America's adversaries has, in measurable ways, accelerated the construction of a world where American leverage is diminished. That is not a small irony. That is a strategic catastrophe hiding in plain sight. Now, I want to address the people watching this who are going to say, look, Iran funds terrorism, Iran's government represses its own people, Iran chants death to America, you can't just normalize this. And I hear that, I understand why those things matter to people, but let's be intellectually honest about something. The United States has deep, functional relationships with governments that do all of those things and more. Saudi Arabia exported Wahhabist ideology that shaped Al-Qaeda. The United States has military partnerships with governments across the world that have terrible human rights records. Foreign policy has never actually been about who has the best values, it's been about interests. That's always been true. So when we apply a values-based framework selectively, when we use human rights as a justification for coercive policies towards some countries and ignore far worse behavior from allied governments, we're not doing ethics. We're doing geopolitics with a moral costume on, and the rest of the world has noticed. That gap between stated values and actual behavior is one of the most significant drivers of American credibility loss in the global South. So what actually happens next with Iran? Realistically, here are the contours. The nuclear program will continue to advance unless there is a serious diplomatic initiative, and a serious diplomatic initiative would require the United States to offer something meaningful, which means acknowledging Iran as a legitimate regional power with legitimate security interests. That is politically almost impossible in the current American environment, where any engagement with Iran gets framed immediately as appeasement. So the most likely near-term trajectory is continued drift toward a nuclear threshold state, a Japan model essentially, where Iran maintains the capability to build a weapon quickly without formally crossing that line. That is a deeply unstable equilibrium, but it may be where we end up. Regionally, Iran will continue to consolidate the influence it has built. The question is whether the normalization with Saudi Arabia deepens into something more stable or fractures under the pressure of continued proxy competition in Yemen, Syria, and Lebanon. The Gaza conflict has complicated that normalization, but it hasn't destroyed it. Both Riyadh and Tehran have reasons to want some degree of stability in their relationship, even if they remain rivals in many ways. And economically, the integration with China and Russia will deepen. The more time passes, the harder it becomes to reverse. Every year that the infrastructure of alternative trade and finance gets built out, the less leverage American sanctions represent. There will come a point, and it may not be far off, where a future American administration that wanted to use sanctions relief as a diplomatic tool would find that the Iranians no longer need that relief as badly as they once did. That is the self-defeating nature of the current approach, and it is happening in slow motion right before our eyes. What should Americans take from all of this? I think the core lesson is about the limits of force and coercion as tools of statecraft. Not because force and coercion never work. They sometimes do. but because they have preconditions that have to be met for them to work, and those preconditions are not always present. When they are not present and you keep applying the same tools anyway, you don't get compliance, you get adaptation, you get the targeted country finding ways around you. You get alliances forming precisely because other countries fear they might be next. You get a world that looks, with every passing year, less like the unipolar American moment of the 1990s and more like a genuinely multipolar competition for influence and position. Iran didn't beat the most powerful country in the history of the world, but it outlasted a strategy, and in geopolitics, outlasting a strategy is sometimes the same thing as winning. That's the uncomfortable truth sitting at the center of this story, and it's one that has implications far beyond Iran itself, for Taiwan, for Venezuela, for every place on the map where Washington has decided that economic pressure is a substitute for diplomacy. The world is watching, the world is learning, and the world is changing faster than most Americans have been told.